and for providing me with a functioning microphone. Thank you. Well, let me start just by picking up on some of the...
I think if you keep speaking it.
Try another mic. Okay, now it's working. So you raised this question at the outset about the potential role for a global carbon price to send a signal on the importance of sending that signal across the global economy. And I want to come back to that because there are, in fact, I think, two paths that we're now following to Paris and through Paris. One is the process of the treaty negotiation that some of us are involved in. That's designing essentially this new framework that will take over from the UN Framework Convention in some ways and take over from the Kyoto Protocol in some ways and provide the way forward for the international community. The second path, of course, is the design of INDCs, which is not a multilateral negotiation, as others have pointed out, but rather it's this very significant effort that's taking place here in India, that took place in the European Union, and now has taken place in more than 50 countries around the world, to basically state to the international community, what are we doing domestically to help to achieve the objective of the convention? And I think what we're seeing is a number of different patterns here. One is that many countries are doing this, as I said, more than 50. We now have coverage of more than half of current global emissions in terms of the scope of those INDCs that have come forward so far. And I think we're seeing patterns across them that isn't exactly harmonization in the sense that the Kyoto Protocol tried to harmonize global carbon markets, but is revealing patterns of similar kinds of policies that countries are putting in place. So many of them, as we've seen in domestic policy in India, have, for example, focused on renewable energy. That in turn is driving markets. It may not be putting a price on carbon, but it's certainly very significantly bringing down the price of renewables. And so that kind of market signal, I think, is already being felt around the world. We're also seeing a similar pattern of policies that are being put in place. So, for example, there's a strong policy recommendation to all governments to seek to reduce subsidies on fossil fuels, to reform the way in which fossil fuels are being supported by governments. They're unlikely to be able to tell a convincing narrative on their own that we are on a pathway to avoiding dangerous climate change. They won't be, in other words, ambitious enough. And that's part because they've been largely designed from the bottom up. So we have to then put in place some kind of system in the Paris Agreement that can give the world confidence that although we haven't made it by Paris, we are nonetheless on the pathway to achieving it in the future. And this is what many people have referred to as a ratchet mechanism or an ambitious ambition cycle that needs to be built into the Paris Agreement. And we and others are very keen to see that the pieces of that put into place by the time that we reach Paris so that we can complete the narrative of how we're going to pass through Paris and on to a sustainable path. There are a number of different elements of this ambition mechanism. One is a commitment by all parties in the Paris Agreement to have their INDCs, their contributions, regularly reviewed and strengthened over time. So that will be part of this ambition cycle. But in order for that review to lead to increasing ambition over time, countries also have to have confidence that the outcome of that review will also be fair, that the increasing ambition of all countries will also lead to fair efforts by all countries in reaching that 2-degree pathway. And there are a number of ways in which we're trying to achieve that, an outcome that is both ambitious and fair over time. And one is by setting a long-term goal in Paris. At the moment, as many of you know, the convention has an objective of stabilizing greenhouse gases at safe levels. We've begun over time to try to define what that is specifically. So we have agreed at political level a collective objective to prevent more than a 2-degree temperature rise globally. We believe that has to be now included in the binding agreement. We also believe that there should be pathways and milestones along that path towards that 2-degree trajectory, including a globally agreed pathway as to where we need to be collectively by 2050, and we hope to be near zero in terms of emissions by the end of the century. We would like that to be reflected in the Paris guidelines, agreed. That provides us some kind of sense of inspiration where the international community intends to be over the longer term, and that will be a very important part of this dynamic characteristic. What then brings the element of fairness into that? Because as I say, that will be critical as well. How will we share out those responsibilities over time? Well, we expect in the future for this also to be largely a process of national determination, but it needs to be more guided by multilaterally agreed principles and guidelines. One of those is that long-term goal that I just mentioned, but another is an agreement by all parties that wherever they stand now in terms of their climate policies and their international commitments or pledges, they will not backslide from those obligations. So we can expect from the European Union to continue to build on its economy-wide emissions reduction target. We are currently under the Kyoto Protocol reducing our emissions by 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. We have made a commitment and we'll agree in Paris to at least 40% reduction from 1990 levels. That's an example of how we are not backsliding and we are progressing from our existing commitments, and we expect this also to come from all parties, this commitment to move forward from where they are currently. And that basically acknowledges that countries have different historical responsibilities. They're moving forward from those. They're demonstrating leadership as they have in the past. That leadership will continue. But it also acknowledges that countries are coming from very different national starting points. So this is a kind of a cycle that's guided by these visions of where ambition needs to get to, but also by principles like common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities that will bring a sense of fairness as to how those obligations will be shared out over time. If I can just make one more comment, I mean, this is all what we're hoping to get agreed in Paris at the global level. But what we hope is that this process of developing INDCs will leave a much more longer-lasting legacy at the domestic level that will provide its own virtuous ambition cycle. So the fact that countries are coming up with these INDCs reflects that for many of them, for the first time, they are committing to regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases as greenhouse gases. And that implies for each country, as they begin to regulate these emissions, that they must, over time, bring those emissions to near zero if we're going to achieve our collective goal of stabilizing greenhouse gases at safe levels. By beginning to regulate CO2 and other greenhouse gases as greenhouse gases, we are in effect putting in place this domestic commitment to move society in that direction. There are other examples of the way in which I think that we will build this virtuous momentum domestically, including recognition of all the co-benefits that have been mentioned this morning, that countries are committing to reducing their emissions not just to contribute to this global objective, but also to achieve things like energy security, cleaner air, more effective public transportation, smarter cities, all those examples of important policies and policy outcomes that we've heard from. Thanks.